So, Michael, welcome to our Coffee Experts Q&A. We've decided that we don't spend enough time on video talking to each other, and this is a great and perfect opportunity for us to discuss some of the more pressing questions about what's happening to education, particularly in light of COVID-19 and the global response to the pandemic. I'm going to introduce myself. So I'm Kate, and I'm part of the Theirworld policy team that works on education financing policy. Michael, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yep, I'm Michael. So I am the early childhood education policy lead. So self-explanatory, but it's something I've been working on with Theirworld for a couple of years while I've been here. And previous to that, I've focused on sort of broader early childhood development sort of issues at different organisations in the UK.
Great. So we have some questions that have been provided for us by our colleagues, but also people that have got in touch just to kind of find out more about what we talk about when we talk about our policy areas and what's the kind of data and evidence that sits behind that. Some of them are a bit more philosophical than others, but I think there's always space for that conversation. So let's kick off with question number 1. Is there a particular person or experience you can think of in your role that keeps you motivated or focused on improving education access? So is there something particularly in the last few months, as it's been really challenging to do this work, has there been something that's kept popping into your head or something that you think about more often that you find is really helpful in doing your work?
Yeah, so I think my main motivation is sort of like learning about the experiences of people quite early on in my career. So one of my first jobs was with a drugs counselling service, and a lot of the issues that I encountered there, it was in the UK, so very specific, very local. And there's a small community of people that you would see regularly, and it was also near where I lived as well. So these are people that, like, homeless people I would see on the street, people that I would sort of encounter just in my day-to-day life. And I think the kind of people that most of us, for just generally kind of see but don't really acknowledge outside subway stations, just outside, off licenses and things like that. And it's just a really sort of set of tragic circumstances that have kind of taken them to that place in life. And a lot of them actually, like, learning about their life history, it was a really consistent theme was that basically in their very, very early experiences were often quite traumatic and very difficult. Often they came from, they were sort of in foster care or living in care homes from quite an early age. A lot of them had experienced like parents with alcohol or substance misuse issues. Lots suffered from neglect and poverty, extreme poverty. And I think one of the things that really that I kept coming back to were these early childhood experiences. And by the time someone, is an adult and has been living on the streets or has been living with a substance addiction for a few years, it's really, really difficult to sort of find the right support for them to get their lives back on track. And I think one of the things that really hit home for me as I sort of progressed through my career and began sort of focusing more on education and more on early years education is that if this is something that you get right at that age, then it increases by quite a considerable degree the chances of them sort of having opportunities to sort of have a stable, secure life, sort of happy sort of conditions and things like that. So really coming to early years education and early childhood development was really about sort of squaring those early experiences in my career and thinking about the people that I used to know and sort of regularly talk to, and just thinking about how we could sort of build a better future for lots of children. And I think one of the things that really hits home as well is that obviously in the UK there is a lot of opportunity for children to attend pre-primary, albeit it's not perfect, but across the world there's lots and lots of children that have no opportunity at all. So thinking about education opportunities, thinking about the impact of early childhood education in terms of people's increasing their chances of staying on in primary and secondary education. And I think it just becomes more and more fundamental to us to think about education in the whole, and actually seeing those early childhood experiences as actually critical to someone's life chances. So that's kind of my main motivation. It obviously the experiences of those people doesn't speak to every child by any means. They're quite extreme cases, though. I think it was seeing that extremities that I think really sort of focused my mind, and it's something that I often return to and often think about when I'm working on policy, and suddenly becomes a bit abstract to sort of return to those conversations and really sort of remember those experiences as something quite important and fundamental for a lot of people.
Yeah, and I think definitely, not to get too philosophical on it, and I like that this is our first question, because I think it gives a bit more context to what we're going to talk about, is that I think there is an element, especially when you work in policy, and particularly my role in kind of financing policy, is that it's a lot of really big numbers, and it's a lot of big numbers, and it's a lot of really big challenges, and sometimes, we're only human. Sometimes things lose their context a little bit, in terms of, we'll have seen it from the pandemic, bad numbers getting worse and worse, and we know the scale of the challenge. And I think sometimes it can be really difficult. You talked about that abstract and applying it to what you're doing. And I think, I have to remind myself that I had a really good opportunity and good access to education, but as a youngish woman, I'm still going to use that. My experiences are not universal, and they're not global, and not to kind of play the card of, what I do has an immediate effect, and it's really important that, my actions are the only thing that can help. But equally, I do think, there is something about holding in mind that when we're working with these big numbers, when we're putting together this data and evidence, that it has a direct impact on somebody's opportunities, that as we're doing it, and as we're pushing decision makers, and as we're being a bit kind of sharp elbows, and we want things to happen, is because there is an impact on somebody's life. And it's not something when we're busy and when we're doing a lot of work, it's not something that I kind of have pinned to my, I would say my office wall, but let's be honest, my now bedroom and living room walls. But it is something I try to remind myself of, that there is context for what we're doing, and it's not always so abstract, which is, I think it's really important for us to stay focused as well. So I feel like that was a nice place to start, but I feel like we need to get a bit more serious, and kind of give the important answers. And I feel like, thinking about what we've been through with the pandemic, how do we feel like there is a way that we can use this moment as giving more momentum to the Sustainable Development Goals and the education goals that sit under them? So we know the challenges, but what can we really use this moment for?
So I feel like the most important thing we can do is kind of re-energize the idea of the Sustainable Development Goals, because the last few years have been tricky. Even before the pandemic, obviously there's been a learning crisis, which we're very much aware of, and I think we can talk about very fluently. There's lots of evidence that supports it, and I think within policy circles, at least, we're very, very aware of the crisis that the majority of the children across the world are actually facing when it comes to receiving a high quality education and actually being able to sort of progress through primary and secondary school with good levels of reading and literacy and numeracy. So without getting into too much detail on that, I think we can just assume that that's an important thing that we need to sort of focus on. But I think I have to remember that the Sustainable Development Goals came in a kind of, they're really, I think, promising and important sort of coming together of countries multilaterally, sort of agreeing a set of principles and objectives between 2016 and 2030, or 2015 and 2030. And I think in the last couple of years, we kind of lost sight of that, the kind of almost utopian sort of ambition of this, and what it actually meant, that we were targeting all children. It wasn't just we were targeting like some children, but actually seeing that the most important ones are the children that have been left behind the furthest. So the most marginalized children, the ones that are experiencing the most discrimination, the ones that, girls, children affected by disabilities, children, by virtue of where they were born or which ethnic group they were born into, geography and clans and all these, and religion, and all these different factors all come into play. And the sort of design of the Sustainable Development Goals is those are the children that we needed to put first. And I think the rigmarole of like politics over the past few years have meant I think we've lost sight of that a little bit. But I think with COVID-19, what it's done is that it's illuminated the sort of challenge of the learning crisis. But I think by bringing, there is a crisis facing all children across the world now. The impact of school closures is very pronounced. Lots of parents in the UK, in the United States, Canada, wealthy countries like that have now experienced what it's like for their children not to go to school and to see the lack of social contact, the lack of opportunities to play and learn together in groups, the lack of, you know, a proper teacher being able to there to sort of use their skills and expertise to guide and nurture these children. So I think it really shines a light on the scale of the learning crisis, and also brings it home to lots of people that I think maybe wouldn't have truly appreciated some of the experiences that many of the children across the world have to actually experience on a daily basis. So hopefully we can use that kind of sense of solidarity, that sense of common goal, that common purpose, but also common tragedy, to kind of motivate us to think about in clearer terms what exactly the Sustainable Development Goals are about and what they're trying to achieve.
Yeah, and I think it's possibly something I'll come on to in slightly more detail in one of the later questions. But I think, you know, thinking about that solidarity angle as well, and thinking about the fact that, you know, we've seen from the pandemic that no country owned the response. No country, well, some countries had worse outcomes than others, of course, but in terms of the globalization of how it affected us, is that potentially that, you know, there's a hope for a slightly more shared mentality, which, like you say, the SDGs were the product of. It was a coming together in a global moment. I think what's been really challenging and sort of really obvious in the fact that we see, you know, for example, the fact that there's such a lag in terms of the funding that's actually needed to deliver the SDGs and the funding that's needed to deliver SDG 4 and the goals on education, is that they haven't really been used to their full potential. You know, it is a policy framework, but within that, it's a spending framework about, you know, if these are your policy goals, then how do you spend to deliver them? And I think that, you know, thinking about what's been brought to the surface with COVID-19 and the pandemic, it's that decisions will need to be made. You know, there's we talk about the phrase "build back better," and we think about whether that's really appropriate for sectors like education, where actually, if we just build back in the way that we were doing before, it's not really fit for purpose. There was already such a momentous kind of barrier to overcome. But actually, is this an opportunity now to see that framework as something useful, that actually we build back by using the SDGs as a framework? And that's how we decide what globally our priorities are: education, gender equality, you know, kind of ending poverty. Those are the kind of key cornerstones, and they're what needs investment. So I feel like this is the moment to do that. You know, there may be more crises down the line. In fact, we feel certain that there will be, and we've got 10 years to deliver on the SDGs. I feel like we're not going to have this opportunity many more times to look at what we've done so far and say, is this still working? Because we have this framework, and are we using this to help us, or are we kind of seeing it as something to beat people with? And that, I think that's always the challenge with the SDGs.
Yeah, and I think with the sort of phrase "build back better," I think obviously there is, you know, the intent there is positive, and it is about sort of using this moment to build solid foundations again. But I think to interrogate it and to sort of actually look at what we have before, as he's saying, when it comes to something like early childhood education, 175 million children were denied access, their opportunity to attend even before the pandemic. These are some of the poorest children in the world in particular. So I think something like 78% of children in lower income countries have never had an opportunity to attend pre-primary. So to build back better would really need to go much further. I mean, for pre-primary in general, it's like, it's not just we're in the last mile of a journey and we're trying to kind of get something where trying to get this kind of percentile of children into pre-primary that are the hardest to reach. If we're actually talking about the majority of children in low-income countries. So the infrastructure for early childhood education wasn't there before. You know, with big sort of pupil teacher ratios in the poorest countries, something like, I think it's in low income countries, it's something like 34 students to every one teacher, which is like in wealthy countries, I think it's less than half that. It's about 14 to 1. So there's a huge infrastructure project. There's a huge focus we need to have on high quality and what that means in terms of teacher training, teacher salaries, reaching into communities and finding people that are actually skilled and have the expertise to do this. But also recognizing that, even with the best intentioned programs, we're talking about the vast majority of teachers not really sort of having a kind of decent salary to live on. So there's a long way to go when it comes to early childhood education. So I think to think about that in terms of the pandemic is to think, well, actually, there is a new moment to renew focus on this, but actually we need to go considerably further than where we were before COVID-19 hit.
Yeah, and I think as when these conversations play out, it's always kind of the challenges occur much quicker than the opportunities and the positives potentially, which feels kind of a strange thing to say. We're talking about education in light of a pandemic, which we know has really suffered, and trying to think about, okay, are there any positives? But I do wonder, we talked about the SDGs and about the potential for this being the moment that we put them front and center again and say, okay, when we're doing more than building back better, but we haven't quite got a jazzy phrase for that yet. So we'll work on that. Here's something that exists that you should be using because it's evidence-based. And I just wonder, flipping it on its head, whether you think there have been any positive changes to education, maybe not caused by the pandemic, or just kind of that have been brought about by the fact that COVID-19 has happened, and how they might need to be a cornerstone of what that rebuilding looks like.
Yeah, I think so. It's kind of one of those ones where you have to spin a negative into a positive a little bit, because I think like one of the things that I think really stands out for me is that we've had a bit of a reality check when it comes to remote learning. I think one of the things that really stands out is the digital divide, that richer children, and this applies as much to the UK as anywhere else, but is particularly pronounced in countries, in less wealthy countries, is that richer children have access to devices, they have better access to data. And I think one of the things that we're talking about remote learning as a concept for the future, we've obviously had to fix it to the present moment, is that actually lots of children are going to be denied access to that for infrastructure reasons. But also I think as well about that is that, is particularly for the early years, is that education is more than just about teaching and learning. It's also about experiences, and particularly for young children, it's about playful experiences. It's about being together. It's about exploring together, learning to sort of make friends, learning to share. Really human things that I think are really, really important. And when children are isolated, not able to see their friends, not able to go to the park together, not able to go to nursery together, I think it really sort of illustrates the importance of contact, of shared experiences. And I think it underlines the importance of schools as a centre and pre-primary centres as a place where people go to sort of experience things that are a little more profound than just kind of like, building literacy or numeracy skills or whatever, as important as those might be. So I think the reality check there is really important, and I think hopefully something we can kind of take going forward. That said, there have been considerable efforts to develop remote learning systems, and I think one of the things again about the reality check is that actually it can come through radio, and this is one of the big success stories, and something that actually came out of Ebola, the pandemic in sort of that hit West Africa a few years ago, is that actually remote learning is about radio instruction, and it's about sort of reaching parents with positive messages across radio and whatever medium you can find, or using like basic rudimentary sort of text services on phones, which may not be sort of the most modern and the most whizzy, but let's certainly have the kind of capacity to sort of have like a WhatsApp service or something like that, or an SMS service and things like that, and just being creative about how we might use that. And that obviously has ramifications in crisis situations when children are suddenly not able to attend school for quite obvious reasons, but just thinking about how we might adapt that, and really sort of trying to sort of unpick remote learning from, I think, this kind of digital obsession, and thinking that it invariably involves very advanced sort of tools and pieces of software that you have on laptops and iPads, and I think really kind of just thinking about what the ramifications of that are.
Yeah, and I think there are like 3 key words that I would pick out of what you said a little bit. I don't think you said all of the words. I think 2 of them I might just have made up. But it's around, I think it's more than just looking at kind of what the response was, but it's also about how it came about. So that idea of being creative, that idea of being adaptable and being flexible. And I think, so if we step back from education and take it in the round with lots of other things, the fact that we've all shifted to working from home, where it's been possible, is the idea that actually we're in a position to respond to people's needs a bit more, in terms of we had quite a one-size-fits-all approach to work and a sort of one-size-fits-all approach to education. But we know that there is not one size, particularly for things like education. We know that the most marginalized, it doesn't necessarily work. That for whatever reason, schools aren't accessible. And you're right that not always digital solutions are accessible. But I think the idea of looking at the solution you've got and saying, okay, but are there other ways that we could do this? And I really, just thinking more generally about what might come out of the pandemic, I really hope that it's an opportunity for us to look at the ways that we were flexible and adaptable across the board, across education, across healthcare, and take a step back and go, okay, we might have not got the exact desired outcome because we were doing this in a crisis. And you're right, on digital rollout, the idea that every child would have access to the internet, we just know isn't the case. But look at the reason that decision was made and say, okay, so as we recover from this, as we start to think about what we could put in place, we don't have to go back to the same model. We don't have to go back to, this is where education happens, this is where work happens, this is where these things happen. Let's remember that we were adaptable and we were able to be flexible and creative, and also, let's make that a more shared process. So, let's speak to the teachers and educational professionals who have delivered this, who have stepped up and been resilient in the face of a global crisis, and say, okay, what were your learnings? Can we make this a more participatory process? Because I think that feels really important. And just to reflect back on something that you were saying, I think way back in the first question, around the fact that there's also just much more awareness of education and the lack of it. And I think that feels, for 2 professionals who advocate for more funding for education and more awareness of the importance of early childhood education, that can only be a positive. Mm-hmm. And I think, whether it feels unfortunate or not, I think it's quite often true that for something to feel real, you have to really feel it for yourself and you have to see it for yourself. And we know that can be a challenge of working on global issues and on development issues. But I think, like you say, the prominence of, I remember that week when, there were front pages dominated by the fact of, we're failing our children. Mm-hmm. And our gut instinct to respond to that is, okay, but we've been doing this for a really long time now globally to maybe the children that you and I can't see. But this is what's been happening to children in low income countries, increasingly so in lower middle income countries, who have been really badly hit by the pandemic and their sources of finance. Is that, this is now a hot topic, and we have to, I think the onus is on us now, and people who are really advocating for better outcomes for global education, to do something with this moment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so too. So I think that brings us to a question about actually how can we make a strong case for investment in education, and what evidence can we show to decision makers that it's important? Because, as we say, the pandemic illustrates that there is the depth of the learning crisis. It now affects many more people, and the crisis of learning. And I think it's like, what do we naturally now do to make that case?
Yeah, and I think that I'm going to start with the problem. I'm going to start with the challenge. I think the challenge with education is that we so often feel the moral pull of making the case for education, and we feel the moral pull of that it is a child's right to an education. And that is not always the easiest point to make when you are in an evidence-based business, when you need hard evidence of why this works. And so there's a balance, I think, between recognizing and harnessing that energy that went into people saying this is not good enough, we're failing our children. That's moral outrage. That's outrage that we're failing our children, and that needs to be harnessed. And I think that's part of it. But I also think that we need to cut through this problem, which is that investing in education, and I'm possibly going to tread on your toes here in your policy area, but you can come and give a much more fuller answer, is that especially for early childhood education, the kind of the payoff, the gains of investing in early childhood education are not seen until so much further down the line, that quite practically the leaders that we are calling on today to make changes and to take bold actions and from my perspective to open their wallets and give some money, is that they may not see the immediate rewards from that investment. Globally, we will share in that. And I think that's something else that feels really important, is this idea that you can isolate investment in education as something that just happens in a particular country or under a particular government, when actually we're going to see in 5, 10, 15 years the impacts of what has happened to education over the last year. Those impacts will be felt. And so I think it's finding that balance when we think about what evidence we need to show to decision makers that it's important. We need to recognize that the decision makers have their own basis for making decisions. They need evidence that allows them to spend money and for that to be a popular decision with the people that they, in the countries that they govern in. But equally, we need to get that balance between the moral evidence, which is this is the right thing to do, and we know it's the right thing to do, that children, particularly girls, and thinking about the importance that education plays in gender equality, we know that it's right that these children should have an education. But we also need to make the case that it is worth the investment, even if you don't see the initial payoff. Your economy, we know your economy will improve. We know that globally, we're all going to benefit from more doctors, more teachers, more engineers, more scientists, more authors, more filmmakers. Everything. Education is the root of all good things, and we know that, and that's why we're so passionate about it. And I think finding that middle ground is really important. And I, from your perspective, I think particularly that's a challenge with early childhood education. But I'm wondering, is there something in this moment that we've given ourselves, or that's been given to us by the pandemic? Is there something more we can do? Is there a more compelling argument that we can make?
I think, there is to pick up on a couple of things that you just said there. So I think the idea of the long-term impact of early childhood education, I think, is very clear. We have this figure that I think is really telling, and that's for every dollar invested in the early years, you're expected a return of $17 in the long term. But as you said, it's like, who is the beneficiary of the $17 beyond the child? And I think the challenge is that 12 years, 13 years down the line. So who is going to be picking that up? So it's a kind of complicated argument to make, because although it's very straightforward in economic terms, it's like, if you're a politician and you obviously have your own incentives and interests, and you're likely not to see yourself in power in those 12, 13 years, then what is the motivation for you? And I think that then kind of underscores the other point you were making about the kind of moral argument. And particularly amidst the pandemic, you have a situation where many children, many millions of children, talking actually hundreds of millions of children, are suddenly, through no fault of their own, denied an education, and be it in the short, medium, and potentially long term for some children who might be the most adversely affected and actually, because of this, don't return to primary school or don't return to secondary school. So, and I think in particular, the sort of lives of younger children it's even more sort of compelling and urgent, because these are children that have real, no agency in their own sort of lives, and they're very much dependent on their parents and their communities and their schools and all the support sort of structures around them. And given the importance of development in the first 5 years of a child's life, where 90% of the child's brain is sort of formed in that period, we're effectively saying that if you don't invest in early childhood education now, you're sort of effectively saying that child's life courses may already be set. And I think in a time of a pandemic, that's particularly tragic. So there is a moral argument. It's like, to avoid a lost generation of children, you need to actually put the money into early years. And it's not a zero-sum thing where you're putting money in the early years at the expense of basic education or university education, but rather seeing that as a whole, a continuum. The more children you have going through early childhood education systems, the more chance they have of actually making it to university and becoming a doctor or becoming a nurse or many number of amazing sort of career opportunities. And I think that moral argument is really, really important, because I think it humanizes the situation for lots of families who are experiencing sort of similar things and seeing their children not going to school and wondering what that actually means in terms of their development, in terms of their sort of social interaction with other children, and feeling a bit like distraught about that possibility of the children not maybe reaching the potential that they imagined that they would have. So it's kind of it's being clever and being human in actually making that case. And maybe we don't quite have that compelling narrative set out yet, and maybe that's something that we need to actually put more of our attention to think through what are the ramifications for it. And we have a very clear ambition at Theirworld, and that's we want to see governments and donors invest 10% of their education budgets on early childhood education. But I think we also need to talk about the implications of what that 10% means. It's an evidence-based sort of calculation, and it's something that's absolutely necessary by 2030 to ensure that all children have access to high quality early childhood education. But actually, what does that mean in terms of like teacher salaries, teacher motivations, like learning resources like books, toys, infrastructure for early childhood education? Like what does that 10% actually mean in moral terms? What does it mean for the long term of children, and what does it mean, I think, for society and communities at large?
Yeah, and I think thinking about the second part of that question, what evidence can we show to decision makers? I think it's about bridging that gap between what we talk about when we talk to decision makers, which is often very, we talked about this earlier at some point. We cut out the nuances and we cut out the caveats, and we try and sell it to them very straight. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the things that we've been thinking about at Theirworld is that it's also about empowering those decision makers, and I bulk a bit of the word empower because I think it gets used quite badly. But if we're talking about what evidence can we show to decision makers, I think it is about that question. It's what evidence do we need to create that makes that case really clear. So thinking about how education financing is working, we know we've already said that before pre-pandemic it wasn't working. It wasn't working in the right way. We know, for example, that there are still huge swathes of the most marginalized children, the most vulnerable children, girls, people with disabilities who aren't being reached the way that we're doing it. And so this is an opportunity to go back to decision makers and leaders and say, okay, we can show you the evidence of what we've been doing and the impact it's been having. And we hope you sort of agree with us that this is not enough. It's not really good enough. And therefore, we don't want to build back in the same way. We don't want to just get the show back on the road or whatever other sort of glib kind of statements you can say. It's more than that. It needs looking at again and rebuilding, and actually giving those giving those decision makers and leaders confidence that, if we land that moral argument for education, giving them the confidence that investing in education is the right thing to do. Fundamentally, it's the right thing to do, and showing them opportunities for how they can step up and do that. So I know that coming out of a pandemic, and I think it's fair to say we've seen with some donors that they have gone the opposite way, which has been quite disappointing, that they haven't seen this as an opportunity to step forward and say, okay, this is a real opportunity to reset the dial a bit and to look at what we really want to achieve. And they've sort of stepped back and said, let's close shop a bit because we're really nervous and it feels quite a vulnerable moment for us and globally. And I think we understand that, but there is that support mechanism, which is, now is your chance, now is your moment. We know that the UK, for example, is hosting the G7 this year, and that there will be the G20 meetings and the UN General Assembly in September, and there will be all these global moments where the opportunity is there, to set out a new path. And I think being able to show different ways of doing things. So one example that we talk about is how education needs in sort of low middle income countries, which are kind of almost the forgotten middle in terms of, they have huge amounts of inequality in country, and a huge percent of the out of work children live in low middle income countries, but very often do they get sort of financing that's really targeted to their types of economies. So one thing that we're trying to show to leaders and decision makers is to talk to them about the International Financing Facility for Education, which I'm going to refer to as IFFED because it's a lot easier to say. And we have a video kind of explaining how that works, just to make it a bit easier to understand. But I think that actually showing these options and saying there are ways you can do this better. We've got the evidence. We can show you the impact that making these bold decisions, taking these big investments now will help you with. We just need you to have the faith, and we need you to have the confidence that it's the right thing to do. And I think that that's really what 2021 and 2022 and beyond that will be about. And I feel like we've sort of come to a moment where it feels like there's a lot of hard work to be done, but it is a real moment of opportunity, and we sort of need to seize it, and we need to put pressure on the people making the decisions to see it that way too.
I agree. So we need to use the pandemic as an opportunity to actually reshape the conversation and to remind people of their responsibilities and the commitments that were set out in the Sustainable Development Goals. They're effectively promises to children, and we need to fulfill those promises. And the thing about the goals is that the longer we wait, the harder they are to achieve. And really, the next couple of years are going to be critical. And we shouldn't see this as a lost year, as difficult as it was, but rather a one where we can reset and actually refocus on our priorities and actually deliver that promise.
Well, I feel like that's quite a rallying cry, and I feel like that's a good point to end on. So thank you for joining me for our coffee Q&A experts chat. It's quite nice to do something a bit different. And I'm sure that we'll speak soon.
Yeah, thank you. I'll see you soon.
Did you know that even before the coronavirus, there were 260 million children around the world who each and every day weren't going to school? There was a crisis in global education, which will only get worse now because of the pandemic. If we don't act soon, by 2030, more than half of the world's children will not possess the skills they need to find even the most basic work. And how will we find the next generation of doctors and nurses and teachers and engineers if we don't give children everywhere a quality education? Despite being desperate to do the right thing, some countries simply don't have the resources they need. That is where the International Finance Facility for Education comes in. It's a bold new fund aiming to raise at least an extra $5 billion for education in just 5 years, changing the lives of hundreds of millions of children. It works like this. Donor funds are pooled to provide guarantees for multilateral development banks, like the World Bank. The banks then leverage this money to create a larger pool of new funding. Alongside direct grants from donors and with the facility's multiplying effect, this means each dollar in aid pledged unlocks $4 more. Instead of crippling high-interest loans, lower-income countries will receive funds at affordable low rates. Those countries can then provide quality, inclusive learning for millions more young people and introduce long-lasting reforms. This will mean happier, healthier, and more peaceful societies. And that is the key to unlock big change.